Welcome into the latest episode of the Unpaid Interns. It's Friday, October 23rd. So happy to have along with us today a reporter for The Athletic who covers the Penn State Nittany Lions, Audrey Snyder, joining us. Audrey, thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
You got it, Austin. Thanks for having me.
Well, we've talked to a couple IU reporters this week about this upcoming game, and obviously it is Indiana-Penn State Week 1. Big Ten football is back. Before we get too into the game, obviously the biggest news coming out of Happy Valley this week has been the loss of Journey Brown, or at least the official announcement that he's likely to miss the entire season. What's your initial reaction to that and how that could impact Penn State?
Yeah, so it happens officially Monday night about 11:30 p.m., so not the most convenient timing, which always seems like that's how these things work. But yeah, the Journey Brown rumor started spreading actually on an Ohio State message board of all places. So that started about 2 weeks ago, and then we're, of course, like most places, not seeing practices this year. So, you know, we get B-roll sent out once a week to us, and we could see on that he wasn't, he was in street clothes, wasn't practicing. So definitely there were some rumors. Penn State still won't say what it is. They also won't rule out that he won't come back this year. But right now, I mean, you're without your starting running back. You already had your best player in linebacker, Micah Parsons, opt out earlier this summer. So there's a lot of depth in that backfield to help withstand this loss, but certainly not where you want to be heading into week 1.
No, who are some of those people that maybe Indiana should be watching out for, Indiana fans maybe? I know Brown's coming off a great year, had a really good Rose Bowl. Who fills his shoes?
Yeah, so Noah Cain's going to be the guy. He was a freshman last year, really impressed in that role as a true freshman. And the thing that's really impressive with Noah Cain was if you look back to his Iowa game last year, he looked like a Big Ten running back in terms of like he looks like that guy when it rains, when it snows, that can kind of plow through people, very much a downhill runner. So he'll be the number 1 now. And then his classmate, fellow sophomore Devin Ford, should be backing him up. And Ford will also take over the kick return duties, which also used to belong to Journey Brown. So you have that. And then, excuse me, they have 2 true freshmen in Kevon Lee and Keziah Holmes. Both of those guys they're anticipating on playing this year. And James Franklin even said this week, hey, we'd like to get the 2 freshmen into a game just to see what they look like. So how much they get in, if any, for me, the interesting thing is going to be how much does Penn State rotate that backfield, because last year it was almost like a continuous rotation. Every series, every second series, there was another guy in there. So it's a deep group. It's a talented group. Cain and Ford were both former 4-star guys, as were Lee and Holmes. So, I mean, you've got a really good group to pick from. And I think if there's one position on this offense that's built to withstand an otherwise pretty devastating blow, it's the running back. So they're young, but there's a little bit of experience there, at least with the top 2 guys.
Number 8 in the AP poll coming into week 1. I guess it's week 8, I think, of actual college football, but week 1 for the Big Ten's purposes. What's the excitement level in Happy Valley right now? Is there kind of a sense of, okay, this is a team that could contend with Ohio State, could be a national contender, or is there some angst, some concern, some cautious optimism in the air?
You know, the thing with the James Franklin coach team is that they're very in tune to like the whole one game at a time mantra, as cliche as it is. As I think annoying as it can be, the players have really bought into it over the years. So, you'd think it'd be easy to say, well, you got Indiana, overlook it a little bit, and get ready for Ohio State. But that's not really been how Penn State's approached things, especially the last few years under Franklin. So to me, it's a matter of, and a lot of players have said this too, it's like when something's taken away and then you get it back, like you feel pretty good about it. You maybe appreciate it more. James Franklin said that he hasn't really had to pull it out of his players in practice this preseason, that they're ready to go. They're anxious, eager to go. So, it's just bizarre that everybody looked at this season from the outside for Penn State and said, okay, with Journey Brown, with Micah Parsons, you're getting Ohio State in Beaver Stadium. For a whiteout, usually that atmosphere can kind of count for a few points when you look at how close those teams have played each other. But now you're not getting any of that. I mean, you get Ohio State week 2. You're not going to have any fans there. Journey Brown, who knows how long he's out. Micah Parsons is training for the NFL. So it's really just unfortunate because if there was a year where Penn State could take its best shot at the Buckeyes, it was supposed to be this one. And now everything's just certainly changed.
In a macro view of Penn State, at least from someone who's a Big Ten football guy, been around Indiana for a while, just from a Big Ten point of view, it feels like Penn State is right there. If you had to compare them, it feels like Georgia with Alabama. They can't get over the Ohio State hump. Is there anything that any sort of, well, maybe James Franklin isn't the guy that can do that, or what does Penn State need to do to get over that hump?
You know, I think it's just kind of a really weird combination of things in terms of Penn State's playing at an insanely high level right now. You know, you're looking at a team coming off the Cotton Bowl, and they've produced big-time NFL talents. I mean, you've got arguably the face of the league right now in Saquon Barkley, you know, recently removed from your program. Micah Parsons is going to be potentially a top 5 pick. Pat Freiermuth should be a first-rounder. So, like, they're churning out big-time guys, but you just can't seem to get it all together at the same time with them. And I think part of it is recruiting right now. Penn State has done a nice job recruiting, but Ohio State's recruiting out of their mind. So how do you keep up with that when Ohio State is just on another level? It's kind of like everybody else chasing Clemson, where it takes so many factors. And let's be honest, like, yes, it's recruiting, it's skill, it's closing that talent gap, but you got to get a little luck in there too. And that's where you've got to be healthy when you play them, you know, and with Penn State and Ohio State, like when you get them at home for a whiteout, it's such an important opportunity. And that's what we saw in 2016 when Penn State, you know, shocked Ohio State, really shocked a lot of people, upsets the Buckeyes, then runs the table, goes on to win the Big Ten and plays in the Rose Bowl. And, you know, if that game's in Columbus, who knows what happens. But when you're playing in Beaver Stadium, 107,000 people at a whiteout, it matters. And that's also winning games like that is how you change it around on the recruiting trail. So a lot of stuff that for Penn State that you just got to say, okay, you know, you got to have, it's like chicken and egg. Like if you got to have the talent to beat Ohio State, and you can't beat Ohio State, you know, if you don't have it. So what do you got to get first? And so it's really just interesting to kind of follow that because it's a year-round battle. You know, we all want to look at week 2 and say, oh, what's going to happen? Well, really, let's look at what's happening, you know, in March, April, May, June, July on the recruiting camp circuit, all those things before you get to the game. So I think Penn State would feel a lot better if it was just one thing that they could change to turn it around. But there's so many factors, and every kid, of course, is different. So we'll see. But right now, it's going to be tough for Penn State and really everybody else to try and chase Ohio State.
Obviously, this is a talented Penn State team. You're ranked top 10 to start the season. You don't just get there by previous years. It's a very good team. What are some of its strengths that they're returning from last year, and where could be some spots they need to plug up some holes?
Yeah, I think, you know, the best thing that they did this offseason was bring in a new offensive coordinator in Kirk Ciarrocca, the former Minnesota OC. And by bringing in Ciarrocca, what they've done is they've made this blended, meshed offense, which is supposed to highlight some of the things that Penn State's done well the last few years, but also, you know, add into it what Ciarrocca really thrived at and excelled at doing, especially at Minnesota. So to me, you got Sean Clifford now. He's going to be in his second year as the starter. But I want to see how Clifford is different this year. I want to see if he can improve on some of the shot plays, the deep balls, what his accuracy looks like, because there were moments last year where he looked really good. Then there were other moments where you're kind of like, there's, you know, you got to make some improvements and see what changes with him. So Clifford, certainly it's an asset. You got a returning quarterback, but the downside to this is, like everyone in the Big Ten, most teams in the Big Ten, you didn't have spring ball. You had this disjointed summer of workouts. Then you had that month-long instructional period in September. So I want to know where's the timing at with this offense, right? You've got Pat Freiermuth, who didn't opt out for the NFL, potential first-round pick. That's a big asset. The fact that he and Clifford work really well together, that's good. But again, how does that all fit into the bigger context, the bigger scheme of this offense? So that is going to be interesting. The biggest challenge for them is going to be the receiving core. Penn State's got a #1 wideout in Jahan Dotson. But the storyline all preseason, and really this dates back to last year, is who can step up and go with Dotson. And for Dotson, we're talking now he's got to go from being a number 2 to KJ Hamler to being the undisputed number 1. So you've got that, and we see the depth chart this week, and Parker Washington, a true freshman, is going to be one of their starting receivers. So you don't have a whole lot of proven experience out there with Dotson in the receiving core. What they do, figuring out what they can do with that group is going to be a storyline for Penn State all year. So those are things I'm looking for on the offense. As for the defense, tons of playmakers back, which might sound kind of crazy when your best player isn't there in Parsons. But they've got a pretty deep linebacking core, good experience. I think their defensive ends are going to be really good. The one guy who everybody's kind of buzzing about is Jason Oweh. It's going to be his first year as a starter, but this is a guy who runs a 4.3 40-yard dash. He's consistently been among my colleague Bruce Feldman's annual freaks list. Oweh's always been in the top 5 of that the last couple of years. So you've got somebody that teams are really excited about. Penn State fans are excited to see what Oweh looks like. But for me, the biggest concern with that defense, and this is where I think it could be a little bit of an interesting chess match with Michael Penix, Penn State's defense struggled last year with defending the shot plays. They were tremendous against the run, so teams were trying to pass the ball more against them, obviously, and they succeeded quite a bit. So what is going to change in that secondary? That, to me, is the interesting thing. You've got 2 senior safeties, so Penn State feels really good about that. But you got a redshirt freshman corner in Joey Porter Jr., who's going to be starting out there, which was a surprise on the depth chart this week. So you got Porter Jr. alongside a senior in Tariq Castro-Field. So the secondary should be pretty good, but they just got to shore up some of the breakdowns that they had last year that really exposed them at times.
Now, let's focus in on Sean Clifford a little bit. You talked about him there just briefly. I think Nick Sheridan, IU's offensive coordinator today, was talking about how he beat them with his legs last year, a couple touchdowns on the ground. Obviously, he can be a dual threat guy, but where's his number one got to take a step up spot if he wants to kind of lead Penn State through the Big Ten?
I think it's his accuracy. And now I know his numbers were skewed last year because the receiving core had a lot of drops. So he wasn't getting much help last year, but that was kind of the thing where, you go back to the Minnesota game and you look at the interceptions there and you're like, all right, if he makes this throw, maybe it ends another way. I mean, Penn State was so close last year, and Clifford will even say this, like they are 1 or 2 plays away from games going another way. Like, it's very minimal with him. But yeah, the point you make about his mobility last year, that was something that really was a pleasant surprise for Penn State. When they recruited Sean Clifford, he was not a very mobile guy. He will tell you that. Everybody that recruited him will tell you that. But he's really worked on it since getting to Penn State. And so now he's a guy who can make some things happen with his legs, but that's not the best part of his game. I mean, it's supposed to be about his arm and what he can do and kind of using the legs to help him out. But the downfall of that, the problem with that mobility last year was that he took so many hits, in part because of extending plays like that. By the end of the year, he was really banged up and didn't even start the season finale, which it was Rutgers, didn't matter. It was a great experience for the backup in hindsight, but he was really broken down by the end of last year. So you got to be able to limit the hits on him. But I do think this is somebody with Kirk Ciarrocca's offense that is going to take some of those checkdowns now that we didn't always see him take last year. So I think just by naturally doing that, you're going to see, his completion percentage go up. I think he's going to be more accurate. But again, how much that receiving core helps him out, that's really still to be determined.
This is quite a battle at the quarterback position. Michael Penix, a little bit unproven. Clifford, much more proven than Penix. But I think 2 of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten here, week 1. Has Clifford, do you kind of sense anything like he has something to prove this year at all to try and prove he's one of the elite quarterbacks in the Big Ten?
If he does, he'll never say it. Okay. I think, for him, it's just about what can this offense do? Like how high is the ceiling for them? Because this is a team that, let's be honest, you want to compete for that Big Ten East title. You want to be playing in that Big Ten title game. You want to be pushing for a shot at the college football playoff. I don't think they're there yet. Maybe with a fully loaded roster that we expected they would have had, they would have been. But right now, I just don't sense that. But yeah, Clifford won't come out and say that. But I do think, I mean, these guys are uber competitive. Like, I think there's certainly a sense of, hey, you don't want to always be second fiddle to Ohio State. They're not going to say it, but I'll say it.
That's fair. I think you and I are allowed to say that kind of stuff. But
all the time. I can look ahead to Ohio State. They can't.
Yes, no, they should probably focus on the game at hand. You mentioned the ceiling being obviously Big Ten championship, NCAA playoffs. What are you seeing as the floor, and maybe expanding a little bit more on the ceiling? It's such a weird season. Only 9 games. 8 regular season games, no non-conference games. Is it fair to even set expectations on a season like this?
It's tough. I mean, the thing is, you get a positive test, you're missing 21 days. I mean, this thing can run through a team. And one of the things that James Franklin brought up the last 2 weeks, which I think is a really interesting COVID-related point, is, yes, they're going to take all these precautions when they're traveling, and Penn State is going to fly to Indiana, but they're staying farther away from Bloomington than they normally would. Franklin said they're going to be in the biggest hotel they could find with ballrooms to like spread out for meetings. But they're concerned with the guys who don't make the trip, right? What are your non-travel squad guys doing? Are they being really disciplined when they're at home on a college campus on a Friday, Saturday night? How does that work? What are the interactions with parents after the game, or before the game, Friday night at the hotel? Like, can you even have that? Is it safe? Is it, okay to do those kinds of things? So, yeah, it's just so tough to try and figure out this season, because you have one outbreak and like, there goes everything. Conversely, it could happen to your opponent too. And so I have Penn State as a 7-2 team this year, and I don't have them beating Ohio State. I also am not totally sure where that second loss is going to come. Maybe it's Michigan with a new quarterback, with maybe actually legitimately having a quarterback. It also could be in that Big Ten's Champions Week against, I'm projecting the second place team from the West. So to me, it's so tough. This is my, I want to say maybe 11th season covering the team. And you don't know what to expect, because, I mean, we're seeing it other places too. Like, what if somebody is just like, I'm opting out in the middle of the season? Like, it's so different. But I do think Penn State is about a 7-2 team. And I think, you got to be on upset watch this week with Indiana. I know a bunch of my colleagues at The Athletic certainly are as well. But yeah, it's just a weird year all around.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. Let's zone in a little bit on the game this week. It seems crazy to me now. I've been an IU fan / media person for 20 years now. And They do this every year where it's like, this could be the game, and then they don't pull it off. And then this one, they go to the fourth quarter and then they lose it. But the odds to me, being under a touchdown against a top 10 team seems like, okay, maybe there's a national view of Indiana that's a little bit better than normal. What has Penn State been saying about this Indiana team this week?
Yeah, James Franklin came out on Tuesday and said this is the best Indiana team they've ever faced. So I think that's, he doesn't always, he's always very complimentary, but he doesn't often come out and say something that strong. So I think that also hammers home the message, if anyone is looking ahead, not named me, to week 2 against Ohio State. You've got a tough competitor in Indiana. And I know, talking to a bunch of my colleagues at The Athletic this week, our Ohio State writer, Bill Landis, he and I do a podcast together on Tuesdays, the Big Ten football show. And Bill's picking Indiana. And now I'm at the point where I'm wondering, are too many people maybe bought into Indiana, especially
that's where I am. There's too many people around. There's too much optimism. It's scary.
And I was saying to people, I'm like, well, the atmosphere is going to be so weird everywhere this year. And then I'm like, well, we have been to Indiana where it's been really splotchy in years past. So, maybe not. But yeah, I mean, I just think with Michael Penix being healthy, there is a legitimate buzz around Indiana, at least at a national level. And I think you look at how they played Penn State last year, and you're like, okay, like this is a team that, especially with it being week one with no, non-conference cupcake tune-up games, it could give Penn State some trouble. So I'm excited to see what happens. But yeah, maybe too many people are bought into the Hoosiers.
That's my scare. But I will say last year, I mean, arguably they could have won that game. That weird fake punt that cost them a touchdown and a couple of penalties here and there. But they were right there. I did not expect that on the road at Penn State. If you had to go out and say what you think the result might be this week, what are you leaning to?
My pick is Penn State 30, Indiana 20. I think that Penn State's the funny thing here is, like, all last year with Penn State, it was like for most of the year, it was this big question of, okay, who's their best running back? And some weeks it looked like it was Noah Cain. Some weeks it looked like it was Journey Brown. Devin Ford sometimes flashed. And the guy who's no longer here, former 5-star Ricky Slade, there were weeks where he looked like, in moments he could be the guy. So now I think, like, this whole running back problem, which is like a really good problem for Penn State to have, I do think it could get interesting this week between Cain and Ford and, like, who looks better in this game. But I also think a guy that we didn't talk a whole heck of a lot about this offseason in general, Shaka Toney, Penn State's defensive end, because everybody's kind of been obsessed with Jason Oweh and the physical freak that he is and all those kinds of things. But Shaka Toney, last time Penn State played out at Indiana 2 years ago, he had this, like, crazy game where he just stuffed the stat sheet with 4 sacks. So it was like this bizarre game. And I just remembered that earlier Wednesday when I was working on a story, and I'm like, oh yeah, 2 years ago, Shaka Toney was such a guy. So I think Shaka could be an impact guy again this year. I'm picking him kind of as the sleeper pick for this game. But yeah, I've got Penn State 30, Indiana 20.
Well, even with Penix's lack of reps, Penn State's one of the teams that does know a little bit about him because he started against Penn State 2 years ago. So we'll see if maybe that has some play in it. I do want to talk a little bit to you about your journalism career. It's kind of we like to mix that in here on our podcast. And I know we were talking before you came on about how you worked for your school's paper and you kind of liked what we were doing here with this podcast. How did that experience for you kind of help you get into the profession and get to where you are now?
Yeah, it was huge for me. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and people are always like, why did you go to Penn State? And, like, so many people from my high school go to Penn State. Like, we always joke it's like the 13th grade because we live like 3 hours away. But for me, it was Penn State had a sports journalism program. So that was the real attraction. Get to school, and, like, one of the first things I did, I started the summer before. So, like, summer before freshman year, went to the student newspaper, tried out, made it, and then spent the next 4 years there working around the clock. And what is unique about my career is that I've never left, which was, like, never the plan. I covered the football team 2 years as a student. My junior year for the paper, the Daily Collegian, and then my senior year, I was interning with the Reading Eagle and also the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. So I became their Penn State beat writer. And then the Penn State scandal was my senior year. So the scandal hits and you're thrown into the fire and you're working for everybody. So I was a freelancer for USA Today pretty much almost my entire senior year and after I graduated. So then after that, I covered the Olympics, which was crazy. Covered the Olympics. Penn State sent 5 of us over there as an opportunity to be interns with the U.S. Olympic Committee. So did that, then came back and started applying for jobs. And just so happened that summer that the Harrisburg Patriot News, which was coming off a Pulitzer Prize for their Jerry Sandusky sex abuse scandal coverage, they had an opening for a Penn State football writer. So I did that job for a couple years. Then the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had an opening for a Penn State football writer. So I stepped up and did that. And so it just kind of one thing parlayed into another. And the next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh, I've been covering this team since, 2010 at this point, which seems really crazy because I'm 31. And, like, I guess little more of, or about a third of my life has been spent covering this program.
That's awesome, and it's really cool because you've gotten to really know the program and know that. I'm sure you've gotten to know some of the players and the coaches and even some of the fans. I'm sure that from around the program.
Yeah, it's really cool because like there's some people, and it still surprises me. They'll like leave a comment or reach out on Twitter. They're like, "Yeah, we've been reading you since you were at the Collegian," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I should apologize for probably some like really awful leads or like really weird stories that have transpired in the last 10 years." But it is really cool, and you're at the point now where like. One of Penn State's grad assistants, Dion Barnes, I'll be talking to recruits. They'll be talking about Dion, and I'm like, yeah, I covered him, when he was a freshman and a sophomore at Penn State. You kind of date yourself a little bit, but it's been great. It's been fun, and I feel like with every job, and especially in this business in 2020, you learn more skills with every job, and you look for ways to continue evolving and figuring out, okay, what works with my coverage, what doesn't work. What do I want to change? So it's always a constant challenge. I can tell you that for sure.
Well, we've had quite a few people on from The Athletic, and they always talk about how, and a lot of them during the pandemic, we had them on in April or May, June, July. How has that kind of helped you during the time with no sports, and what has it been like to work for The Athletic?
I'm sorry, Austin, you cut out for a second. I caught part of that. You said you had guys on from The Athletic during the
we had some people on from The Athletic. They just talked about how they've kind of let them be creative. They've let them, even in a time of no sports, they were able to still create content because of what The Athletic kind of lets them do. What's it been like working for them, and where have you kind of tried to be creative the past couple months?
Gotcha. Yeah, man, it's been weird. One of the things that I'm like most proud of during this whole pandemic time in terms of like finding stories. One of those ideas that I've always had that's just like kind of been on a list that I keep on my desktop that's like, hey, if ever I have an insane amount of time, this is what I want to write. Actually got to cross one of those off the list I guess it was summer. I was really interested because, and Penn State fans are really interested in this too. It's kind of crazy. But one of the things I wanted to know was what happened to the Joe Paterno statue when it was taken down in 2012. For all that went on at this place, in 2012, all the missteps, Joe Paterno getting fired over the phone and the reaction to all of that, like it was just madness. The only thing that really went off without a hitch was Penn State removing the statue and then putting it somewhere in secret in the middle of the night, and none of us ever know what happened to it. So I said to my bosses back in probably like May, I'm like, hey, I want to do this long form story about searching for the Joe Paterno statue. Thankfully, they didn't laugh at me, and they're like, actually, that's a pretty good idea. I'm like, but you have to strike the right tone with it because, there were so many serious things that happened around here that you don't want to rehash all of that. You don't want to keep digging up old wounds. But it's still really interesting of like, where in the world is this statue? And so I spent a few months reporting on it throughout the spring and summer and looking for it, and wrote a big long form story. And we had a podcast that accompanied it about my search for this statue and me going all over town and surrounding communities, and why Penn State is so insistent on not even telling me if this statue is still in State College. So it was really fun. But it was also like one of those things where I'm like, yeah, I probably would never have the time to do this. And if I was working elsewhere, like I wouldn't have the resources to pull this off because it was so much back and forth with my editors. And hey, what do you think about this section? What about this style? And literally, I'm sitting here at my desk where I'm at right now, and I printed off a campus map to look at the number of storage sheds to be like, okay, where in the world do you stash a massive bronze statue that you don't want anymore? So it was really fun. But yeah, The Athletic pushed us to be creative and to dig into these stories that we always wanted to do. So like Penn State had a fan cruise that took off. I guess it would have been early March when everything started shutting down. When the NBA shuts down, this Penn State fan cruise is out in the middle of the ocean. So I talked to people on the fan cruise, like, what was your experience like? Sue Paterno and Jay Paterno were on the cruise, so I talked to them. So like, you found a way to write other stories. You wrote about what was interesting to you, which is what I always like to do, because I think if it interests you, hopefully it'll interest readers. But yeah, we were faced with an abundance of time. And then, of course, you're trying to find as many football stories as you can do in there as well, and recruiting coverage. But yeah, it's been quite the off season, I'll say that.
I'm assuming you did not find the statue.
I did not, which it got toward the end. Honestly, it got to the point where I was like, the story is better if I don't find it, because it's just one of those things where it's so insane that you're just like, all right, maybe like at some point I'm going to do a follow-up story on it, because I created a statue tip line email. So I had people emailing in where they think it might be or where they heard it is. So at some point I will circle back and keep looking, because that is the one question I had gotten the most from Penn State fans like in the past decade, is like, hey, so where's the statue? And so it just got to the point, like, there's mini statue replicas around town, and there's one bar sells t-shirts with the statue on a milk carton. So like, it's a playful thing, and I'm going to keep looking for it. So we'll see what happens.
We have much different circumstances, but we have these giant, like, I don't know if they're bronze, but they're big fish that like spit water out into a fountain in the middle of our campus, and there's 5 of them. And when they won the title in '87, the basketball team, they lost, like, one of the fish got somehow taken out and carried away. They've never found it. So there's 2 like conflicting rumors. You won't win another championship until you find the fish. You won't find the fish until you win another championship. It's kind of a weird dynamic, but no one knows where that fish is.
So you guys got to start searching for it. Put in some FOIA requests. I did that for the statue, but because of Penn State, Pennsylvania's really weird open records laws, they're really restrictive. My FOIA request was swiftly denied.
There's a lot of fake rumors that Bob Knight has it in his basement somewhere. I don't know. Don't think that one's true. But I did want to talk. Obviously, this is at times a tough field to be in as a woman. I think there's some people out there that make it harder than it needs to be on social media and whatnot. What has been your message to other people? I know you're an adjunct professor with Penn State, so I'm sure you kind of become a mentor to some people. What's your message to other women trying to make it in this profession?
You have to block out, and I feel like this is such a cliche because every football coach says it when they say it, I hate it, but you got to block out the noise. And the mute button on Twitter is gold. I like to mute people as opposed to blocking them, because I feel like blocking them gives them like some weird satisfaction maybe. But yeah, I mean, if you spend the time reading what people say about you in your mentions or on message boards, like, I seriously would never get anything done. It would just be this constant of, oh my God, she hates the program, get back in the kitchen, blah, 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 blah. Oh my God, this was an ugly outfit today. What did she do with this? Like, why isn't she wearing makeup today? Like, nobody cares if my colleagues show up and like look like I do now, like look like a slob for an interview. Like, that's like not an issue. But if a woman does it, it's like, oh, she's so unprofessional. How dare she do that? And it's just like this really messed up double standard that it bothers me, but it doesn't bother me as much as I used to, because I just try to pay, way less attention to it. And that's something that I always tell students, whether maybe they're my students or whether it's people I'm mentoring. I've been involved throughout the years with Penn State's Association for Women in Sport Media, and also with the national chapter of Awesome. And so, you build up your network that way, and you have this really great network of women and men who are great allies for you that have really been great. And I've been fortunate in that Penn State, the vast majority of the times in my tenure here, has been tremendous. And there's only twice, 2 times that I can think of where stuff's happened that I had to go to Penn State and I'm like, hey, whoa, like we gotta stop this. One time it was just, and like on the scale of things that people say, like this was not a big huge deal. But I had, when I was I guess I was a student, there was a player who was like, oh my God, this woman should never write anything about football. She doesn't know anything. And it's because she's a woman. And I was like, hey, we got to address that. We can't have that. And Penn State swiftly responded, and the kid apologized and whatever. But it was just like, you know, people will say, I could write the same exact thing as another male on the beat, and you're going to get some people really whose opinions we shouldn't consider or shouldn't care about. Some people are going to say like, oh, she's insane, this is terrible, blah, 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 blah. Or they'll say, oh yeah, the guy, yeah, that was fine, he said that. So there's that double standard. But I've been fortunate to be surrounded with really great people on the beat, and other people. And I think the cool thing now too is so many of these players are used to seeing female reporters. Like they see people, whether it's at the high school level or out on the recruiting trail. So like when they get to college, a lot of the guys have been around this for quite some time. And like, you know, everybody has a mother. Most people have aunts. Most people have sisters. Like it's really, it's a respect issue. So I've been really fortunate that Penn State and my colleagues have been tremendous about it. But I know that's not the case for every woman. And I know that it's really frustrating when I see it online. And, you know, I was reading an article earlier today about why aren't there more women in sports radio? And, you know, the responses on Twitter, not particularly great. You know, some males were saying it's like, oh, well, this is why you don't see as many men as elementary school teachers. And it's like, no, like this isn't the point. More opportunities in this business, more diversity of voices, better perspectives is better for the listener. It's better for the viewer. It's better for the reader. It's better for the consumer. We don't all look at the teams, the programs, the subjects that we cover through the same lens. And if we all did, that'd be really, really boring, and we probably wouldn't learn anything.
Absolutely. No, that's totally, I think the notion that you need to be like a former athlete or coach to know anything about the sport is just factually wrong. And I think it's time we move away from that.
And it's something that, I mean, I've sat in many of press boxes where something happens in a game and I'm like, wow, the guy sitting however many seats down, he has no idea what's going on, you know, but people won't come at him because he's a guy. Where with me, it's like, oh, she clearly got this wrong. She doesn't know it. And I think it's like, you got to have a willingness to learn, whether you're male, female, that part doesn't matter. Most of the people that, you know, cover sports didn't play at a high level. I always like to make this comparison too. Like, how many people cover the government? So many. How many people have been president? Right? Like, you don't have to be president to cover the government. So why do you have to be a former star athlete to cover a football program? Like, it's bizarre. Now, I do think certainly it's advantageous for X's and O's, those kinds of things. You want to have that, but anybody can learn. Like, it's just so different to me, because what would you rather have? Would you rather have somebody who maybe can blend the game from an X's and O's perspective better, but who has no journalistic abilities or integrity? Or, like, why can't we blend the both? You know, like, I think everybody serves a different audience. And I think you need a variety of voices and perspectives and expertise on a beat, because it is not possible for someone to be so skilled in every area. You can't do it. So you have to be versatile in this business, but you got to be realistic about it too.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up on this. You talked about how you've covered this team since 2010. Mm-hmm. A lot of great athletes, like you said, have come through the Penn State football program. I'm going to put you on the spot. Give me your top 5 Penn State football players that you've seen come through during your time.
Well, one is easy. One's got to be Saquon Barkley. I mean, he was just out of this world. I remember being out at the opening, so that would have been the summer going into his senior year of high school. And out there, it was kind of like, like, this guy looks pretty good. Super, super nice person too. That was, I think, the other part about Saquon, that, you know, you get to know him a little bit, you get to cover him. He was just a really genuinely nice person. So he was definitely number 1. 2, because there's one memory that really sticks out with it, I'll go Allen Robinson at number 2. The catch he made over Channing Stribling in the Michigan game, it was ridiculous, and it happened right in front of me. So you see that, you see the athleticism. And Allen was a really cool story too, because he was like a 3-star prospect. Penn State, in some ways, stumbled upon him because they went to recruit his quarterback at his Michigan high school, and like the quarterback ended up not being great, but you ended up getting a really good receiver out of it. So Allen was incredible. Trace McSorley, I'd put at 3. Everybody, or so many people, wrote him off, and oh, he's not tall enough, he's not big enough, this and that. What he did with Joe Moorhead's offense, it was incredible. I mean, this was a team that you're coming off of sanctions, a program that you still had insanely good talent there. But the way he led and how fiery he was, and some of those hits that he took, you're just like, man, that shouldn't have happened, to get back up and keep playing. So I put him at 3. Chris Godwin, I'll go at number 4.
Okay.
Wide receiver. His performance in the Rose Bowl was like out of this world. And so this was a guy from Delaware where you're thinking, okay, like maybe he can develop into something. Who knows? Then you look at it now and you're like, yeah, this guy really good. You know, played on Sundays, being productive, went healthy on Sundays. Number 5, man, 5 is tough because recency bias would probably say Miles Sanders, but yet we only got to see him in 1 year as a starter. So, I mean, there were some impressive plays in there, but it wasn't like Barkley where you had that, you know, full assortment, a bigger sample size. So 5 could be him. Mike Gesicki was a freak. I mean, you're talking big time high school volleyball player, basketball player. So he was really good. Man, I feel like I'm shortchanging the defense here too. This is easy. I've forgotten about him already. I can't have this list without Micah Parsons.
There you go. There you go.
I mean, I would probably put Parsons at like probably 2. I should adjust my entire list and put Parsons as, see, not even gone a few months and how soon you forget. But yeah, him in the Cotton Bowl, that was out of this world. Like he was playing like crazy. So yeah, I've already forgotten him, but definitely shouldn't.
Well, I know here in Bloomington there's a lot of excitement for the game this week. I'm sure there is in Happy Valley as well. So thanks so much for hopping on the podcast here and giving us a Penn State perspective of things. And enjoy Bloomington this weekend. I know you won't be able to get out and see the town much, but at least you'll get to be there.
Yeah, sounds good, Austin. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that'll wrap things up here for our Friday episode. Thanks so much for spending the morning with us here on Unpaid Interns. We'll be back on Monday as I kind of hand it off to Griffin Epstein. He'll be the main host starting on Monday when we have Jack Grossman joining the show. Remember, you can watch all of our episodes on the IU Sports Media YouTube page and get us on wherever you get your podcasts. For Audrey Snyder, I'm Austin Render saying so long for today's episode of Unpaid Interns. Have a great weekend. Enjoy some Big Ten football, and we'll talk on Monday.